Hello and welcome everyone. It's great to have you on board tonight for another instalment in the MLA Productivity and Profitability webinar series. My name is Courtney Cheers and I work with the webinar series coordinators aggregate. This webinar series is designed to deliver topics pertinent to sheep and cattle producers in relation to the productivity and profitability of their businesses. These webinars are recorded and can be accessed at a later date on MLA's website. The title of tonight's webinar is Fodder Conservation in Late Spring and will be presented by our guest speaker tonight, Michele Jolliffe, who is a Dairy Extension Officer at Agriculture Victoria. A bit of housekeeping tonight before we get started. For those that aren't familiar with this webinar platform or need a refresh, the control panel that you can see to your right is able to be opened and closed using the red arrow so that you can enjoy the full screen view during the presentation. You should be able to hear us, but we can't hear you. So I encourage you to use the chat box in the control panel to communicate any questions you have during the presentation. Please make sure your questions are as clear as they can be so they can be addressed with relevant responses. When you log out of the webinar, a survey will be there for you to fill out. I'd encourage you all to take the time to fill this out. The feedback that we receive from this survey is really important to the continuation of this webinar series as it allows us to assess whether we're hitting the right topics for you, the audience. So let's kick off tonight's webinar. Our presenter, as I said, is Michele Jolliffe of Agriculture Victoria. Michele is employed as a Dairy Extension Officer and based at the Warrnambool office. Michele has been working in the areas of grazing and pasture management for over 25 years across Victoria. During her career, she has focused on dairy pastures and forage production, and in particular, silage production. We are very fortunate to have someone with so much expertise in this area presenting tonight. And so with that, I'm going to switch over to you, Michele, if you're ready.
I sure am. Okay, is that right to go there?
Yep, all good.
Not a problem. Thank you very much, Courtney, and thanks to everyone for making time this evening to hear me wax lyrically about making hints and tips for making quality hay and silage. So hopefully I can enlighten you somewhat, maybe excite some people to try some silage, and just some good reminders about what we need to do to make sure that we get good quality hay and silage. So I guess the best place to start is to look at it and say, okay, so what are the advantages of using, say, silage or hay within our system? So one of the big advantages with silage is that we can use it as a pasture management tool. It allows us to cut earlier. It's a lot less weather dependent than hay. We have higher quality, and we usually are also able to get improved regrowth. The other thing is with hay is it's also our pasture management tool. It can be a really good quality feed if it's cut at the right time. It's much lower cost than silage. It's much easier to store, and it's a lot easier to transport and sell. I guess the big thing to think about is if you're going to head down the silage lane is to really think about the access to appropriate machinery, and whether you've got contractors, if you haven't got the machinery, if you've got contractors in your local area to be able to help you to make the silage that you might be looking at doing. The other thing is as well is to think about the class of stock that you're going to be feeding your feed to. So if you're going to be feeding it to young stock or growing animals, silage sometimes can be a really good option. If you're feeding it to older stock to hold over, maybe hay might be a better option for your business. So really thinking about what you're actually wanting to feed instead of saying, oh, I'd like to try something new. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the suitability of crops for ensiling. So you can see on our list here, we've got maize, whole crop cereals, ryegrasses, your other grasses, your grass clover mixes, clovers and lucens. Now, when we start at the top at maize, maize is actually one of the easiest forages to ensile. Lucerne, on the other hand, is one of the harder ones. It's not that it's impossible to do. It's actually, you know, it is quite achievable, but you can't cut corners with it. Whereas maize and the whole crop cereals and ryegrasses are a lot more forgiving. So if you miss a couple of steps, if you don't quite get it right, the timing right, you're still going to end up with a reasonably good product compared to something with like your lucernes and clovers, that if you cut a few too many corners, you can actually end up with a product that's not really suitable for that end class that you're wanting to feed. So what do we do to make sure that we've got quality silage? Because that's our aim. And our biggest aim is that we want to make sure that we reach our target dry matter as quickly as possible. That's the real key, is we want to hit it as quickly as we can. We want to try and make sure that we mow, wilt and harvest within 48 hours. And before everyone goes, we can't do it in 48 hours, it's thinking about the size of the area that you're trying to do, maybe looking at doing it in batches. But you really don't want to take any longer than 72 hours. And the reason behind you don't want to take any longer than 72 hours is that the quality starts dropping rather rapidly. So what you can end up with is with a forage, you could have cut a forage that is looking absolutely magnificent, but by the time you actually get it ensiled into a bale or into a pit, the quality has started to drop off, and all of a sudden your product that you've got that you're looking to feed out in 6 to 8 weeks time is nowhere near as good as what you'd originally had hoped, and you won't get the live weight gains or the production benefits that you were aiming for. So when we think about hay, we also want to make a quality product with hay. One of the key things is, just like silage, you need to reach your target dry matter quickly. The other thing is that if you're using or making cereal hay, you want to make sure that your seed heads are also at that target dry matter. So not just the stalk, you actually and the leaf, you're actually wanting to make sure that the seed heads are also at that target dry matter, because if they're not, sometimes you're going to have some issues with spontaneous combustion. Another way to make sure that you hit your target dry matter quickly is, particularly for heavy crops, look at using a mower conditioner. And the reason around the mower conditioner is that it breaks the stalk and allows the plant to respire and wilt quicker, which means it hits that target dry matter that I'm talking about a lot quicker. So with your pastures, look at using a flail or a tined type mower conditioner. If you're going down the cereal line, look at using a roller mower conditioner. It's a lot more effective. It cracks the stalk better, and in some cases super conditioners if the crop is really, really heavy, particularly with cereals. If you've got a legume dominant or clover dominant pasture that you're looking to put into hay, look at cutting when it's still flowering and still actively growing, because you've got a really good quality forage that you're going to then put into your hay. And if it's a grass dominant, look at more once the grasses are actually flowering. So it is going to have less leaf than silage, and it will generally be a lower quality, but you're going to end up having more of it, which for some people that's what they'd actually prefer to have, is they'd prefer to have a bit more hay on hand than necessarily having a higher quality product, but not as much. So I was talking about pasture quality there and seed development. So when we look at a leafy tiller, like a leafy pasture, it's looking at megajoules of energy of around 11.5 to 12.5 ME. So, I often say to dairy farmers, that's rocket fuel. Cows are going to milk really well on it. Sheep are going to grow well on it. Cows are going to produce well and grow good beef on it as well. But as we move further into spring, we start to see the quality level of that pasture starting to drop off. So by the time the stems and the flag leaf starts to develop, and that bit of seed head starts to come out, so that early ear emergence period, we start to see the ME starting to drop from around that 12.5 back to about 10 to 11 ME. Now, this is a really good time to actually be thinking about cutting silage, in particular silage is at that early ear emergence, because it's that trade-off between quality and quantity. You still get a good quality product, but you get a lot more of it. If we look a bit further along here, once the seed head gets further emerged, it drops from, you know, that 10 ME down to 9. By the time we get to seed shedding, it's sort of 6 to 8 ME. And in a dairy system, we'd often say if you're feeding hay that's at that 6 or even silage, there has been farms that have put that into silage, that 6 to 8 ME, what you've actually got is dry cow stuffing. So it keeps cows full, but they're not going to milk off it and they're not going to grow off it. So you're really aiming to try and get your hay and also your silage, you're wanting to be around that sort of 10 to 11 ME, but your hay, you're definitely wanting it above sort of 9, 8 to 9 up to 10 ME is what you're really aiming for to be able to get production benefits from that hay and silage that you've actually been making. Some other stuff that we were looking at is there was a trial that was run down at Demo Dairy in Terang called Project 3030. It was part of a Dairy Australia funded project that was undertaken by research scientists from Agriculture Victoria and the University of Melbourne. And it was looking at using cereal silage particularly as a way of increasing the amount of forage that you had available to be able to feed to your herd. Now, with that trial, what we found was that trying to cut at that boot stage, you actually got a much better quality product, but your yield was a lot lower. Now, so that was the bit of the trade-off around that. But the interesting thing was, as we went further through the trial, was that they were finding that even when they cut at soft dough, as you can see from the pictures here, so you've got boot stage right through to soft dough, where when you squeeze the seed head, a soft doughy starts to come out of the seed head. Even though the ME was only about 8.8 and it did yield quite well at that 17.9 tonnes of dry matter per hectare for triticale, the milk responses were actually a little bit better than what was anticipated from the ME that was fed. So that is something to think about, is that you can go that little bit, you can go that further on if you want to, and you will often see an increase in milk production, but there's not a lot of evidence that backs it up, but because there's not a lot of trial data that's floating around. But if you're thinking about going with your cereals and putting it into silage, it's generally, if you're wanting to aim for that higher quality stuff, is to actually cut at boot stage, but you do get that trade-off between the tonnes per dry matter per hectare compared to the ME that you're feeding. So wilting is really important in the process of making sure that we hit the target dry matter that we've decided that we're aiming for, depending on what type of silage or hay that we're making. And I guess the thing is that wilting really is not leaving mown pasture on the ground before harvesting it. Wilting is actually making sure that you evaporate the water from the mown crop whilst it's lying on the ground. And that's really important, is it's not just a case of we just cut it and we let it stay there. We want to make sure that we evaporate as much water out of that crop that we've cut as we possibly can. So how do we do that? Well, one part of it is windrow width. So windrow width. So the width of your windrow is actually really important for wilting. So if we look here, we've actually, where the mouse arrow is at the moment, that's actually a double windrow. So that's gone through and been cut. That is really hard to actually get dry because the wind and the sunlight can't get in there to dry it. When you're looking for most efficient drying or most efficient wilting is actually when you've got a wide, low windrow. That actually, you get much better drying much quicker than if it's left up in a double windrow or even just mounted in a single windrow. So that's one thing to think about, is that we want to make sure that we've got low, wide windrows that we can get good drying rates from both sunlight and also wind. So sunlight is good, but sunlight and a bit of wind is even better. That helps us get our drying and wilting curing rates a lot higher, a lot quicker. So we hit our target dry matters. So what are the other things that we can do to speed up the rate of our wilting? So ideally, as I said, fine weather is great if we can get a bit of that. Lighter crops, they'll always dry that bit quicker. We should always wait for dew to lift. So, and the reason behind that is that the dew, when it's on a forage early in the morning, is actually an additional 1 to 2 tons of water. And thinking when you're wanting to dry things, you're wanting to get away as much water as you possibly can. So just by waiting for the dew to lift, that's an extra 1 to 2 tons of water that's already gone. Use a mower conditioner. They are really good, particularly for the heavier crops and also for any cereal crops. That's really something to be thinking about. Make sure you leave a wide, low-density windrow, like was shown in the photo before, and use a tedder straight after mowing. I cannot reiterate just how important tedders are to be able to ensure that you can hit your target dry matters as quickly as possible. So I don't care how you get one, beg, borrow, steal, just get hold of one. Tedders, they just make life so much easier when you're trying to get that that target dry matter that we're chasing. So the biggest thing with tedders also is to make sure that you set it right, that it doesn't pick up any dirt and flick dirt into the forage that you're then spreading out across the total ground area. The reason being is as soon as you get dirt into silage in particular, that's where mold can grow. So what you can end up with is a very small clod of dirt that'll be in a bale or say in a silage pit, for example. And what you can actually find is you can lose up to 20 or 30% of the forage in that bale just from the additional mold and slime that ends up around that clod of dirt within the silage bale. And the biggest thing is the last thing you want is for stock to be eating any of this mold. Generally, if livestock are well fed, they don't tend to eat it. They look at it, turn their nose up at it and walk away. But if animals are a little bit hungry or it's, maybe a drought situation, if they will try and eat it. And unfortunately, we've seen cases where, herds of dairy cattle have either people have either lost a large number of cattle because of it, or cattle have got sick and gone off their milk. And so it's really important to make sure that you don't get any mud or clods of dirt or anything in your silage when you're baling it back up again. So make sure with your tedder that you set it right at the right height so you don't end up picking up any dirt. You just want to spread all that forage out on the ground and make sure that you can get as much sunlight, as much wind across it so it can dry as quickly as you possibly can get it to. So the target dry matters. This is the stuff that I've been harping on about. So the big thing about our target dry matters is to look at the range that we're after for our conserved fodders. So this figure that I've got here is actually sourced out of the Top Fodder Successful Silage manual. So if you're interested in going forward and doing some silage later on after this present, or thinking about doing some silage either next season or this season if it's not too late, depending on where you are, go on to any of your search engines and put in Top Fodder Successful Silage, and you'll be able to, up this manual will come, and it's actually a really good chapter by chapter you can download and read. So you can, if you want to do lucerne silage or maize silage or perennial ryegrass, any of those, it's actually got a whole heap of really detailed information. So if you're thinking about heading that way and haven't had a lot of experience and there's not a lot of good contractors floating around, have a look at this Top Fodder Successful Silage. Just whack it into any of your search engines and it'll come up. So it's well worth spending some time looking at that. So our target dry matter ranges for conserved fodders. So when we start off, we've got a fresh pasture. You're looking at around 15 to 20% dry matter. If you're doing direct cut or, unwilted silage, again, it's about the same as what your fresh pasture is going to be. It's that 15 to 20% dry matter. If we're wanting to put silage into a pit, so do a silage pit, particularly if you're looking at long-term storage of silage, often a pit is one of the best ways to do that. You were looking at either wilted silage, either long chop or short chop. And if it's a long chop, you're aiming to get that 30 to 35% dry matter. And if it's shorter chop, you're looking at that 35 to 40% dry matter. If you're going into a bale, you'll be looking at trying to get around that 35 to 50% dry matter. Any wetter than 35% in a bale, and the bale will just sag. It won't hold, it won't form well. It'll sag and it'll start to produce a bit of effluent as well, which is the last thing you want. Any drier than 50%, and it sort of starts to head towards that haylage and not necessarily silage, and you don't quite get the fermentation that you're looking for if you're going down the line of doing some silage. The thing with hay is we want to make sure we're between that 80 to 88% dry matter. And in particular, if we're doing cereal hays, we want to make sure that those seed heads are definitely dry. So the thing with if we're going into a silage pit, if we're drier than that, say 30 to 40% dry matter, it makes it really hard to compact. And if you're trying to compact it, so you're using tractors over a pit and you're trying to, compact that well, what can happen is if it's drier than the 40%, you actually feel like you're driving on a roller coaster, which is not great, but it also allows pockets of air to come in, and if there's air in there, that's also another opportunity for more mold to start growing as well. So we actually end up with a product that's nowhere near as good a quality. We end up with the mold floating in through there, and if we're wetter than say 30%, we can actually end up with a whole heap of effluent. And if effluent is coming out of a pit, it's not great. It's actually tends to neutralize soil. Not much will grow there afterwards. And it's the last thing that you really want to be doing when you're going down that line of doing silage. So think about how you're going to do it, where you're going to put it, and also making sure that you really do aim for those target dry matters between that 30 to 35 for long chop, 35 to 40 for short chop, 35 to 50 in a bale, and 80 to 88% dry matter if you're doing hay. So how can I tell that I've actually hit that target dry matter, you say? Well, there's one really quick, easy way, is actually a dry matter percentage hand squeeze test. So this is a really quick and easy way to do it out in the paddock. So you can sample a windrow, grab from the top, the middle, and the bottom. You cut it up so you can fit it into your hand. You squeeze the living daylights out of it. Then you open your hand and you have a good look and see what that ball looks like when you've opened your hand. And this is what it tells you. So if it's less than 25%, the ball is going to hold its shape. It's going to be really juicy and your hand's going to be wet. You're probably going to have a bit of ooze even running out of your hand, depending on how well you've squeezed it. Around that 25 to 30%, the ball will only just hold shape and your hand will only be slightly wet. If you're at that 30 to 40%, the ball will fall apart really slowly, but you won't have any moisture on your hand. And if it's drier than 40%, it's going to spring apart really quickly and there's not going to be any moisture on your hand at all. So that's a really quick and easy way that you can do that within the paddock. Another way that you can do it is actually by the microwave test. So with the microwave test, you take some forage, you take it to your microwave, you make sure you have a cup of water. The other thing is if you're using a microwave, make sure it's a microwave in the shed, definitely not in the house because the smell is something else. And you can put your forage in the microwave and dry it and work out what your dry matter percentage is from there. But the really key points are make sure it's you always have a cup of water in there, because sometimes if you don't, you can set the microwave on fire. And the other one is definitely do not have it in the house microwave, because as I said, the smell is revolting, and some people are really not happy about that. So make sure it's a microwave in the shed. But if you're wanting to just do a quick dry matter test in the paddock, the hand squeeze test is one of the easiest ways to do it, and it's a really good guide to tell you, yeah, actually we reckon we're about right to go, or no, we can wait a bit longer, or we might need to get the tedder out again. So what should you go for? Should you go for yield over quality? If you're doing silage, the answer generally is for crops, yes, and that's because of the issues around the inadequate yield and quality curves available, and we're just not quite sure on how good that milk production data in particular is, or the live weight gain production data is. If it's on pastures, we generally say no. And the reason being is that we go for the early cutting. We get that much better quality product that I was speaking about there earlier in the presentation. So you're looking at that sort of 10 to 11 ME compared to, say, something that's an 8 or 9 ME. Yes, you do get less silage yield, but you get more regrowth. And then you end up with a similar or greater total yield. So being your silage and your pasture. The thing is if you're going with hay, it's generally better to aim for your yield, but make sure if you hit your what you can do is if you hit your dry matter targets quickly, the quality will be better. So when you're going for yield over quality, if it's for silage and pastures, generally no. If it's for silage and pastures, it's generally you go for yield over quality. And if it's hay, aim for yield, but aim to hit your dry matter target of that 80 to 88% as quickly as you can, and the quality of that product that you're going to be putting into a bale is going to be much better. Chop length. Now, I talked about long chop and short chop, particularly with your silage. Is it important? Well, it is if you're trying to feed sheep. And the thing is that sheep are very sensitive to chop length and have a much better intake when the chop length is short, so a fine or precision chop situation. So there was some research undertaken in Wagga in the mid-90s that looked at live weight gain on lambs on precision chop silage, and they gained about 151 grams per day compared to the lambs that were on unchopped silage, and they only gained about 40 grams per day. So again, it really is about thinking about the class of stock that you're wanting to feed it to, or feed your silage to. The other thing is that you've really got to make sure it's good quality silage to get the best production results, particularly with lambs. So you do need to aim for that ME of above 10 for it to get the good live weight gains. With cattle, it's not so much of an issue. Cattle, you can feed long or short chop. It's really not an issue, but you can find that there is a slightly increased intake in beef cattle with short chop, but it's nowhere near as sensitive as it is with lambs. So that's something else to be thinking about, is if you're planning on feeding your silage, particularly to lambs, it's thinking about, well, do I actually have access to that precision chop or fine chop? And sometimes that can be a bit of a challenge if you haven't done it before, or there's not a lot of contractors around that have that that type of machinery that enables you to be able to make a bale with that shorter chop or fine chop situation. So silage compaction, and I did talk about that briefly before when I was talking about dry matter, but it really needs to be done well. And the reason is that fermentation is an anaerobic process, and the compaction minimises the volume of air that's in the bales or the stack, or stack and pit. So you really do want a tight, even-sized bale, and the reason why we want it even-sized is so that it wraps nicely and there's less opportunity for air to get into those bales and for that bale to start deteriorating while it's stored. Another thing is to really make sure that you seal your stacks as tight as you possibly can and repair holes as quickly as you can, particularly in bales, but also in silage stacks. Silage stacks sometimes look like the most amazing things for kids to run over. Generally not a good idea, because a heel print in a silage, plastic can let a lot of air in, and you can have a lot of spoiled feed, speaking from experience. Making sure that you can use tyres, you could use, there's some new products out on the market now where they're just like the sausage that you can have at your back door to stop the wind from blowing in under it, filled with sand, and you lay them across the silage stack, and making sure that you dig in the dig in the plastic at the bottom here. So generally, if you've got that plastic there where I'm showing the cursor now, you'd be looking at trying to dig that in or cover it at least with lime to make sure that there's no air getting in and under that silage, that plastic there. So with the repairing the holes, particularly with silage, with round bale silage, really look at making sure that you get the silage tape. Silage tape, and try and make sure that you match like colour with like colour. That way it will, and making sure when you put it on that you pull it, you don't overstretch it, but you make sure that it's clean and dry where you're placing that tape, because that will hold as well as it will as if you'd wrapped it at the start. You can see down the bottom here, there's some black tape here. That's an absolute no-no. It's duct tape, and the issue with duct tape is when you pull that, it shrinks. It lets air in underneath it. It doesn't seal properly, and whilst duct tape can fix absolutely everything else, it definitely can't fix air getting into silage. So round bale silage or square bale silage if you're going down that route. So make sure that you do invest in the proper silage tape that you can get at all your rural stores or stockers who have silage wrap as well. The other thing is when you're wrapping round bales, make sure that you have a minimum of 4 wraps. Up to 6 is actually not a bad idea, but any less than 4 wraps is a waste of time, because air just gets straight in and it starts to, develop mold. You lose the quality, the bales sag and drop. So it's really important to make sure if you find any holes at all, repair them as quickly as you possibly can. If you're going down the line of doing some silage, don't try and pick the silage bales up with the forks on the tractor. Please make sure you invest in a silage grab, because there's nothing worse than getting through, doing everything right, and then puncturing the bales with the forks on the tractor. Another option is to look at, particularly long-term storage, is to bury silage. The big thing with when you bury silage is to make sure that the forage hits that target dry matter range that you're aiming for. So if it's, between that 30 to 40%, and the reason being is that is the effluent issue that you can have. You want to make sure that you use plastic on the top layer of your stack. So you've got a pit here that in the photograph, you've got forage that you can just see there. It was an oat and lucerne crop, I believe. And across the top, and it's not really that clear in the photo, but there was a layer of plastic. With that, you make sure that you have the layer of plastic on top of it, particularly if you're going to bury it. Because if foxes or rabbits or anything like that start to dig in, they stop at the plastic and you don't get the air coming through. So you make sure you cover it with plastic, then cover it with some straw or old hay. It also adds as a bit of a buffer, and then cover it with soil. And if you're looking at doing this in the longer term, so 5 to 10 years or longer, look at covering it between a sort of 0.5 of a metre to a metre depth. If you're looking at potentially having to use that pit within 4 years, you can use that between that 0.3 to 0.4 of a metre is fine. But if you're wanting to go any longer than say 5, 10 years, make sure that you cover it with a bit more soil, so to that 0.5 or a metre depth. Now, my last point there, and you might think, oh yeah, really, I'll always remember where it is. Make sure you take a GPS point of the stack. And the reason I say that is many years ago, there was a farmer in this in the southwest of Victoria who buried a heap of silage. Everyone was certain they could remember where it was. Dad passed away and nobody could remember where the silage stack was. So they spent probably, I think it was close to 2 years after their father had passed away, trying to find the silage stack that had been buried on the farm back in the 83 drought. So whilst you might think, oh yeah, I'll always remember where it is, you might, but it's always a good idea. Take a GPS point of the stack and make sure people know where it is. It's written down somewhere in a diary or calendar or something, that everybody knows where the silage stack is, because there's nothing worse than having all this buried treasure, so to speak, and then not being able to find it when you need it. The other thing to be thinking about is when you're storing your round bale hay and silage. So, or not, sorry, round bale hay or square bale hay, is that thinking about the storage losses that you have over a period of a year. So this table here is some work that was done by a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine, Frank Micken, looking at how much was lost of a round bale in a 750 mil rainfall, in the 750 mil rainfall zone. So these are the percentage losses that they saw over that 12-month period. So a bale diameter of a 1.2 metre, 1.5 or 1.8 metre, and in the old language, a 1.2 is a 4x4 bale, a 1.5 is a 5x4, and a 1.8 is a 6x4 apparently. And you're looking at in the shed, so if you can get these bales in a shed, you're looking at losing about 8% of that bale diameter over that period of time. If it's covered with a covered stack, so just a plastic sheet over it, you're still going to see a loss of around that 11% in the 1.2 metre bale, right up to about 9, down to 9% in the 1.8. If it's wrapped in plastic and kept off the ground, you're still, you still get that, you still lose, but you start to lose that little bit more than it just being covered in plastic. If it's kept off the ground and not covered, you're losing up to 26%. And if it's just an uncovered stack sitting on the ground, you're looking at losing up to 32% of that bale. So it's really, when you're looking at it, if you can't get it in a shed, your next best option is to look at covering it at least in a plastic sheet. So what are the options here? One of the options that you can look at is having a line of round bales covered in a tarp like that. That is a good option. And the other option that you can look at is, having your round bales sitting on some posts, old strainer posts or equivalent, just to get it up off the ground so you're not losing as much compared to if you just had it sitting out uncovered. With the square bales, again, really is one of these things where you really need to be thinking about getting it in a shed. The other thing is that round bales do shed water better than a square bale. A square bale will generally hold on to the water, it will infiltrate through, and you end up losing a lot more of the bale over a period of time. So there has been some options where people have looked at capping them. So this is a stack out towards Mortlake in the southwest of Victoria, and they've covered it with a tin, and some other people have used a heavy grade plastic. That also works quite well. It sheds the water off quite nicely. You do need to make sure that they are well and truly secured, so you don't have any issues with wind coming up and ripping them off and sending them halfway around the countryside. But really, for a long-term option for long-term storage of square bales, a shed is really the best option. The capped system like this, it'll be okay for probably at the most 2 years. I know some that have been able to push it through to 3, but wherever the prevailing wind and rain tends to come from, you start to see the breakdown of the bale pretty quickly as well. So if you're going down the line of square bales, I'd be definitely looking at trying to invest in a shed, more so than anything else. So in summary, and I know this is a big slide, but in summary, we really want to make sure if we're making silage, we aim to mow, wilt and harvest within 48 hours, but definitely no longer than 72 hours. Make sure that we use a mower conditioner on heavy crops to hit our target dry matters quickly. So for hay, we're looking at a target dry matter of around that 80 to 88%. For our silages, if we're going into a bale, we're looking around that 35 to 50%, and if we're putting it into a pit, we're looking between 30 and 40% dry matter. No, use a tedder, so beg, borrow, or steal a tedder to help you get that, assist with the wilting to get your target dry matter as quickly as possible. Know the target dry matter for the fodder that you're making, be it hay or be for silage. If you're going down the line of silage and you're wanting to feed it to lambs, really think about your chop length and whether or not you can actually make it into fine chop. If you're going to make silage, make sure you try and cut it before early year emergence. If you're cutting hay, so your legume or clover hay, look to cut when you're still when it's flowering and still actively growing. Our grass hay, cut when the grasses are flowering. Cereal hay, absolutely make sure that the seed heads are at the target dry matter that you're aiming for, which is that 80 to 88%. And the last point, if you're going to do silage, remember that air is the enemy. Make sure you seal and repair those holes in bales and stacks as quickly as possible. And thank you.
Thank you very much, Michele, for those very detailed tips and tricks on fodder conservation in late spring at a time when most producers are experiencing such a fantastic season and looking for the best ways to utilise that extra feed. So before we get into some questions, and I must say you've probably answered a few of mine along the way, but I still have a few, and we've also got some written in. For those listening in, don't forget to use the question box in the control panel to get your questions into Michele so we can get them answered for you. But before we do that, I just want to let you know, if you're going to take off early, can you please fill in the survey as you exit the webinar? It's shared with MLA and the presenters to help improve extension efforts and make sure that we're targeting the right topics for you. And just also let you know that next week's webinar will be presented by Jess Richards from the New South Wales DPI on the topic of what to know when increasing the percentage of ewes mated to terminals. And so with that, I think we'll kick off with some questions for Michele. So one I've got is, when you're testing that the hay or silage is at the target dry matter, do you need to look at quite a few areas across the paddock to make sure that you've got a good idea, or is it pretty representative usually?
Yeah, look, it's not a bad idea to go and do a couple samples across it. So you'd be looking at up to 10 to 15 spots, depending on how big the paddock is. Also thinking about if you've got aspects, hills. So if you've got a north-facing part of the hill and so taking those things into to consideration as well. So definitely try and take a few samples across the paddock, depending on the size of the paddock. Like, if you've got a nice small dairy sized paddock of 7 hectares or something, you can get away with 5. If you're looking at a 50-acre paddock or something, you really probably should be pushing it out to 10 or 20.
Yeah, righto, no worries. And so if people are looking to test their silage after it's been made, what is the best time to do that when testing for ME or any other nutritional values?
Yeah, look, when you are looking at testing a silage bale, you need it to actually have time to ferment, for the fermentation process to go through. And for a round bale silage, you're looking at about 6 to 8 weeks before you should be cutting open a silage bale to be, or going with a corer to sample. And in a pit, you're looking at about 4 to 6 weeks before you can actually go through with a corer and test. So you sort of, if you need to feed before 6 to 8 weeks, you probably shouldn't be making the silage to start off with too. So that's another thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, okay. And when you're testing a pit, what do you need to keep in mind so that you're not, sacrificing or spoiling the rest of the pit?
Look, if you're using a silage corer, which a lot of Agriculture Victoria still has some. I don't know if the other departments across the country do, but I know some consultants have hold of them, is a drill powered corer that you can push through the face of a silage pit that doesn't actually make, because they're quite small, it actually doesn't make a big issue, it doesn't allow a lot of air in, and it's usually within the face that you're going to feed off reasonably quickly. If you're going on top of the stack, you can reseal it seal it properly with the proper seal tape, and you'll be fine. It's the same with when you're sealing out of, when you're sampling out of a round bale silage, is making sure that you just seal the holes back up again with silage tape, and it'll be fine.
Oh, righto. Yeah, no worries. So Jim's got a question. What is the best thickness of plastic to cover large squares of silage?
You're looking at, you'll be using the silage wrapper, and you'll be looking at doing up to 6 wraps.
Okay, yep.
And I can't tell you how thick that is because I'm holding my hand, which is really useful when you don't have a webcam. Yeah, it's probably, hang on a minute, this is serious when I've actually got to resort to a ruler because I'm holding my finger a certain centimeters apart. You're looking at probably about it's about 2 to 3 centimeters is the thickness across the whole bale, but you're aiming for between 4 to 6 wraps.
Yeah, okay, rightio, thank you. And so Sid from Wagga has written in, how late can we go with cereals for hay and silage? Our crops are at heading very early, and we have not had enough dry weather to cut yet.
That's always a bit of a challenge. So I guess that, yeah, how far into heading are they? if it's possible, you've probably got at least till the middle of November, I'd be thinking, where you'd still be able to get good quality out of it. I guess a lot of it depends on how far the heading is and at exactly what stage, if it's at soft dough or if it's still just milky, just coming through.
Yeah, okay. Potentially
sorry
a bit
about
of
that.
an issue
It doesn't really answer the question. I'm really sorry.
No, tricky to manage, particularly if it's going to persist with a wetter season later.
Yeah.
So Jim sort of followed up with another question sort of similar to his first one. Will double covering a large square stack of silage make it last longer? And if so, how much longer would that extend the life?
So by double covering, Jim, I'm assuming you mean a single wrap on the bale, and then covering that bale, that stacks of bale, with a large plastic covering. So that's I hope I've got that right there. You'd be looking at, you would generally get, as long as you can keep the vermin and any children or livestock away from it, you'll be looking at getting at least 2, potentially out to 4 years out of that stack. But a lot of it is going to come down to how well you're able to protect the outer plastic.
Yep, okay. I guess that kind of leads into my question of how long can you, I know you sort of touched on this, but how long can you really store hay and silage for? Is it a case of use it or sell it? Or is it really just dependent on your storage options?
Look, a lot of it really does come down to your storage options and what you can do. With your large square hay bales, for example, if you can't shed that, and you don't think you'd get through it within, say, the next 12 to 18 months, I'd be looking at selling any of that excess before the quality drops off it, and actually make some money off that hay that you've gone and made. With silage, if you can possibly, you can bury square bales and you can bury round bales, but you've got to be quite strategic with round bales how you stack them. You need to stack them on their flat edge, so the edge that you'll see that'll come out on the bale chamber, that's the side that you have to stack it. So you stack them on top of each, like about 2 high, and cover it with dirt. Isn't, in a pit with dirt is an option, but it really does, particularly with hay, really shedding is about the best option that you can do with it, and otherwise sell, because you really can't bury hay, but you can bury silage.
Yeah, okay. And just, I mean, a couple of slides back, you were showing a table of those losses at the different storage options, but also at the different bale diameters. And I noticed that,
Mm-hmm.
a greater diameter, I'm assuming it's to do with your surface area, like there's a less percentage of
Yeah.
that bale that's lost. So what are the trade-offs of driving up that bale diameter? And is that something people should be striving towards, or?
A lot of it actually then comes down to the machinery that you've got and whether or not you can actually utilize that machinery. And I guess not utilize that machine, utilize those heavier bales. So quite often, what we find, particularly say on dairy farms, which being where I've sort of worked, they don't generally have really huge tractors. So when you start to get bales that are all of a sudden becoming 800 to 900 kilos or up to the ton, they actually struggle to have a machine big enough to be able to use them. So it's a little bit of that trade-off. If you've got the machinery that's big enough to be able to handle those big heavy bales, absolutely, bigger does work a bit longer, or does work a bit better, and it will last a bit longer. But if you've got smaller gear, you've got yourself sort of stuck into using a smaller bale just purely and simply for safety reasons more than anything else. Is last thing you want to do is tip a tractor or do something drastic like that.
Yeah, of course. Something to keep in mind anyway. And so Mitchell's just written in his notice there's been some anecdotes about hay that was buried for 20 years or more in the last drought. And so he's just
Mm-hmm.
wondering what's the upper limit to the longevity of buried hay, and is there any way we can reach that long-term storage?
Look, I know of anecdotally of silage that's been buried 30 plus years, and it's been perfectly fine when they've actually dug it out of the pit. It really all comes down to air and keeping air out of it. And I guess that's the big challenge with it, is making sure that it's sealed well enough and tight enough to make sure that, no vermin, but also no air gets in to spoil any of the forage that you've put in that system. So, and gone through and buried. So I guess it does come down to a little bit the size of the area that you can put in as well. But, as I said, we've seen stuff that's come out, been in underground for up to, 30 odd years, and it was perfectly fine. So, but it's one of those chances that you've got to take a little bit too and hope that it still comes out okay.
Yeah, okay. And so you've brought up vermin, and we've got a question again from Jim. Any suggestions on preventing mice problems in hay?
Oh, I wish I knew. A really good cat. Um, yeah, and look, I know mice. I know there's some whispers coming that we are potentially going to have some issues with mice this year. And look, there really aren't a lot of good options around keeping mice out of haystacks. And yeah, I did joke a really good cat, but sometimes I think that might be about the only way.
Yeah, right. Oh, that's a shame. So
Mm.
Toby's written in, what are your thoughts on the use of ag lime to cover and seal a silage pit?
Yeah, the biggest issue with I've got no issue with using lime as long as you've got plastic over the top. And so you have the forage plastic, and then lime. And the reason why you need the plastic in is that lime can't seal well enough. There's still air that gets in through the stacks. So yeah, I perfectly fine to have it sitting on top of plastic, but if you've got lime sitting on top of forage, you can lose anything up to the top 50 centimeters or more.
Yeah, righto. And just going back to the actual making of the hay, you had in one of your key points that you really don't want to go beyond 48 to 72
Now
hours.
that's only for silage, only for silage.
Oh, okay, righto.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean, so
only.
my question is, what's the consequences of going beyond that time frame? And
Yeah, so
yeah.
no, the consequences for going beyond that 72 hours is you actually start to see a really quite a quick drop of about 0.5 of a megajoule for each sort of extra half day that you go before you get it ensiled. So you really want to try and that 72 hours is about as far as you can push it. So if you've got forage that has started off at say 10.5 ME, if you go to 72 hours, it'll be sitting about 9. But as soon as you go past that 72 hours, all of a sudden you end up hitting, you can be sitting at 8 to 8.5 very, very quickly. So that's the whole idea behind you want to try and get it done as quickly as possible. With hay, yeah, it's going to take a bit longer because the forage is generally, there's a lot more of it. But if you can use mower conditioners, tedders, you'll be able to hit those target dry matters a lot quicker.
Yeah, okay. And
So
so,
instead of it being down for, 10 days, it might only be down for 5.
right, okay. So, yeah, 5 to
Yeah.
10 days. Alrighty. So I think that's all the questions, unless anyone had any last minute ones. I don't know whether you, Michele, wanted to give us the 3 most important things that you think growers should take away from this and get right when making hay or silage this season.
Number 1, get a tedder. Don't
Right.
care how, but get one. And I don't own any shares in any machinery company. I wish I did. I have a husband who loves them, loves machinery. But, so your number 1 point is get a tedder. Your number 2 point is make sure you know the target dry matter of the forage that you're making. So whether it's bale silage or hay or pit silage, know the target dry matter that you're aiming for. And the third point is probably time is of the essence. So really think about when you can get it cut, what the weather's looking at before you go. The last thing you want to do is hit it with a mower conditioner, ted it, have everything nearly right, and then all of a sudden an inch of rain turns up, particularly if you're doing hay. So really think about what's the weather doing, get hold of a tedder, and know your target dry matters.
Excellent. Great summary for your presentation tonight. Thanks again for all the detail you provided and answering everyone's questions really well. So, and thank you to our audience for tuning in tonight. Just a reminder to please take the time to fill out the survey as you exit, and don't forget to tune in to the next webinar that will be I think it's in 2 weeks' time, but with Jess Richards from the New South Wales DPI on the topic of what to know when increasing the percentage of ewes mated to terminals. But you'll be sent an email out with the date and time for that one. Thanks again for tuning in, and thank you very much to Michele. I'll call it a night.
No worries. Thanks, Courtney. Thanks, everyone.